In the spring of 1932, America was gripped by a crime so shocking, so unprecedented, that newspapers called it the crime of the century. On the cold night of March 1st, in the small town of Hopewell, New Jersey, the infant son of Charles Lindbergh, America's greatest living hero, vanished from his crib. He was just 20 months old. To the outside world, the Lindbergh baby's disappearance was a tragedy. To those who were there that night, it felt like something more, as though the country itself had crossed into darker, more haunted territory. Charles Lindbergh was not just another public figure. Only 5 years earlier, in 1927, he had changed the course of history by becoming the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic. His plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, carried him from New York to Paris, and when he landed, he was instantly crowned as the new American idol. Newspapers called him the Lone Eagle. Children learned his name as if he were a storybook character. His face was on magazines, posters, and even cigarette cards. But even heroes cannot escape the shadow of tragedy. Charles married Anne Morrow, the daughter of a wealthy ambassador, and together they seemed untouchable, beautiful, powerful, adored by millions. Yet those who knew them whispered that their happiness was fragile. The Lindberghs had grown weary of constant publicity. Strangers showed up at their house just to glimpse the famous pilot. Letters poured in daily, some full of praise, others filled with obsession, threats, and eerie warnings. By early 1932, the couple had retreated to their mansion in rural New Jersey, hoping for peace and privacy. But on the first night of March, their world unraveled. It began like any other evening. Anne put little Charles Jr. to bed around 7:30 p.m. The baby was recovering from a mild cold, so she tucked him in carefully, closing the nursery window to keep out the chill. Downstairs, the family gathered around the fireplace. Charles himself was said to be reading, occasionally rising to check the wind outside. He was obsessed with weather, a habit from his flying days. But some later recalled he seemed restless, as though unsettled by something unseen. Around 9 p.m., the house grew quiet. Servants retired to their rooms. Anne relaxed with a book. Charles moved to his study. And upstairs, in the nursery, the Lindbergh baby slept in his crib, or so everyone thought. At about 10 p.m., the nursemaid, Betty Gow, went to check on the child. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. The crib was empty. The blankets were neatly folded back, almost too neatly. The window, which had been locked, now stood open, cold air sweeping into the room. On the sill was a strange, muddy mark. And just below the window, outside in the mud, investigators later discovered a ladder, a crude, handmade contraption, hastily built, but functional. Near it lay a white envelope with words scrawled in broken English. It was the first of many ransom notes, demanding money for the safe return of the child. The Lindberghs were thrown into chaos. Charles raced through the house, searching every corner, calling his son's name. Anne collapsed in shock. Servants lit lanterns and combed the property, but the night was pitch black, the fields silent. No sound of wheels on gravel, no footprints that could be traced clearly in the mud. It was as though the baby had been lifted out of his home by invisible hands. But the strangeness of the case did not stop there. Several witnesses later claimed they saw odd lights moving in the woods that night, as if lanterns were being carried silently between the trees. Neighbors swore their dogs barked furiously around 9:30, then suddenly went silent, as if commanded to hush. And others recalled that in the weeks leading up to the kidnapping, strange cars had been spotted parked near the Lindbergh estate, their drivers sitting motionless inside, watching the house. When news of the disappearance broke, it was as if the nation itself had been cursed. People whispered of omens, a falling star seen over Hopewell that very night, the sudden death of a black crow in the Lindberghs' garden the day before, and Anne's own confession that she had been tormented by nightmares, dreams of faceless strangers reaching for her baby. Whether coincidence or something more, the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh Jr. felt touched by an aura of doom. Newspapers rushed to the scene, and within hours, the Lindbergh estate was surrounded by reporters, photographers, police, and desperate neighbors. The air was thick with panic, suspicion, and the sense that something unnatural had entered the quiet New Jersey countryside. And so began the investigation that would soon spiral into the largest manhunt in American history. An investigation filled with ransom notes written in code, shady underworld figures, botched police work, and conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Before we dive deeper into this chilling story, if you enjoy exploring America's darkest mysteries, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and let us know in the comments what state or country you're watching from. We love hearing from our worldwide community of mystery seekers. Because the truth is, the Lindbergh baby's disappearance was not just a crime. It was the beginning of a legend, one that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. The Lindbergh estate that night became a place of chaos. By midnight, police from Hopewell and neighboring towns had swarmed the mansion. Detectives searched the grounds with lanterns, their beams of light cutting through the darkness. Neighbors arrived offering help, some of them armed with shotguns. Within hours, the scene looked less like a family home and more like a military outpost. The ransom note found on the nursery windowsill was crude, written in broken English with odd spelling. It demanded $50,000 in exchange for the safe return of the child. At the time, that sum was enormous, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. But what struck investigators most was not the amount, but the odd symbol drawn at the bottom of the note. 2 interlocking circles with 3 holes punched through the paper. It looked like some kind of signature, but one that no one could decipher. Charles Lindbergh, though shaken, insisted on taking command of the search himself. He was a national hero, used to control, used to command. But that night, witnesses said he seemed both frantic and oddly restrained, as though he feared showing too much emotion in front of the police, the press, and even his own staff. Some later wondered whether Lindbergh's tight-lipped composure hid fear of something beyond the ransom. The press, always hungry for Lindbergh headlines, descended in droves. By the next morning, hundreds of reporters camped outside the gates. Photographers jostled for pictures of the distraught Anne. Headlines screamed across America. Lindbergh baby stolen from crib. The kidnapping was instantly the biggest story in the world. Inside the mansion, however, investigators were already troubled. The ladder found outside was strangely constructed, made from mismatched wood and nails hammered at odd angles. Some experts said it looked like the work of an amateur carpenter. Others suggested it was designed to break under stress, preventing investigators from reusing it to test the crime. Then there was the window. Though it had been left open, investigators found no clear footprints in the mud below, only a few smudges, as though someone had wiped the ground deliberately. One detective remarked, "It's like a ghost came and went." The ransom note itself only deepened the mystery. The handwriting appeared shaky, almost artificial, as if the writer had tried to disguise their natural style. Linguists later suggested it was written by someone pretending to be foreign, perhaps German or Scandinavian, but the spelling errors seemed intentional, as though meant to confuse. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed gypsy camps in the area had taken the child. Others whispered about organized crime, that gangsters had targeted Lindbergh because of his wealth and fame. A few even suggested an inside job, pointing out that only a handful of people knew the baby's exact routine. And then there were the strange reports, the ones police tried to suppress. Several neighbors insisted they saw lights moving in the woods again on the night after the kidnapping, as though someone had returned to the scene. One farmhand swore he heard the sound of a baby crying in the distance, only for it to vanish suddenly, leaving the night deathly still. Another claimed he saw a figure in white. "Like a woman in a shroud," he said, walking along the edge of the Lindbergh property near midnight, only to disappear into the trees. Were these the fevered imaginings of a terrified community, or clues that something deeper was at work? Within days, new ransom notes arrived. Each carried the same odd symbol, the two circles with the holes, and each escalated the demands. The second note raised the ransom to $70,000, warning the Lindberghs not to involve the police. The notes were delivered with uncanny precision, appearing in places only Lindbergh or his intermediaries could find. It was as though the kidnappers were watching every move. Charles Lindbergh agreed to negotiate. He reached out to intermediaries, men connected to the criminal underworld of New York. The most famous of these was John Condon, an elderly retired schoolteacher who became known as Jaffe. Condon placed ads in the newspaper, communicating with the kidnappers through coded messages. Soon, he was meeting shadowy figures in cemeteries, handing over envelopes of cash under cover of darkness, always believing the child's release was close. But the baby never appeared. Instead, the ransom notes continued. Some claimed the child was safe. Others hinted that he was already dead. The Lindberghs were tormented by uncertainty, their every hope raised and then dashed. By late March, the investigation had grown desperate. Police interviewed servants, friends, even extended family. Rumors swirled that one of the Lindbergh staff might have betrayed them. The nursemaid, Betty Gow, was hounded by the press. The butler was questioned for hours. Yet no one could be tied to the crime. And all the while, the nation watched in horror. Parents held their children closer. Communities formed night patrols. For the first time, Americans felt that even in their own homes, even in the beds of their children, safety could not be guaranteed. But behind the official investigation, darker whispers persisted. Some claimed the strange symbol on the ransom notes was not random, but occult, a sigil connected to European secret societies. Others pointed to Lindbergh's own fame, suggesting the kidnapping was a ritual act designed to humble America's greatest hero. Whether rational or supernatural, one thing was certain. The Lindbergh case was an ordinary crime. It was the beginning of something much larger, a storm that would soon sweep across the entire country.
By mid-March of 1932, the Lindbergh case had taken on a life of its own. What began as a crime was now a national obsession. Every front page carried the baby's face. Every newsstand headline screamed for answers. Strangers mailed letters claiming to have seen the child in Boston, in Chicago, even as far away as Havana. Thousands of tips poured in, and almost every single one led nowhere. In the middle of this chaos stepped one of the strangest figures in the entire story. Dr. John Condon, a retired Bronx schoolteacher in his 70s. Known for his eccentric personality and his flair for the dramatic, Condon wrote a public letter to the kidnappers, offering himself as a go-between. To the shock of investigators, the kidnappers answered him. They demanded that Condon be the sole intermediary, that he deliver messages through classified ads in the New York American newspaper. Soon, the papers were filled with odd notes signed by Jaffe, Condon's chosen alias. Each one was a desperate plea to the kidnappers, and each was answered with yet another letter bearing the strange double circle symbol. The letters unnerved investigators. They weren't simple ransom demands. They dripped with menace and peculiar phrasing. "We warn you not to make foolish police play," one read. Another warned that the baby is in gut care, though the broken English seemed too forced, as if someone were trying to sound foreign. Condon eventually arranged a meeting. On a chilly night in late March, he claimed to have spoken with a shadowy man in a Bronx cemetery. The figure called himself John. His face was never fully seen. They spoke in hushed tones among the gravestones, the glow of a lantern flickering between them. John insisted the child was alive, hidden safely, and would be returned when the ransom was paid. Condon was convinced he had spoken with one of the kidnappers, but skeptics later argued he had been deceived, that John was a decoy meant to drain money while the true fate of the baby was sealed elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Lindbergh family struggled under the weight of rumor and superstition. Anne confided to friends that she was plagued by terrifying dreams. In one, she saw her baby standing in a field, reaching for her with outstretched arms. But every time she ran toward him, he stepped further back, until he disappeared into a forest. In another dream, she saw a black carriage moving slowly up their driveway, though when she looked out the window in waking life, the path was empty. Neighbors whispered that the Lindbergh family was cursed. They pointed to Charles Lindbergh's own father, who had been a controversial politician, hated by many. They noted that Lindbergh himself, though adored, had enemies, not just jealous rivals, but darker forces who saw his fame as dangerous, even arrogant. Some said the kidnapping was no crime of greed at all, but an act of revenge, or punishment, or ritual. Strange coincidences seemed to fuel these theories. Just weeks before the kidnapping, a fortune teller in Newark had reportedly warned Anne that her child will not grow old. Days before the crime, a black crow had fallen dead on the Lindbergh lawn, a bad omen in many folk traditions. And the night of the kidnapping, neighbors swore they saw a streak of fire cut across the sky. A meteor, perhaps, but one that seemed to mark the moment when America's golden family fell into shadow. While superstition spread, the official investigation stumbled forward. Condon continued corresponding with the kidnappers, receiving yet more notes. Each one cryptic, each one tinged with threats. One letter instructed him to deliver the ransom to a specific location in the Bronx. Another suggested that the child had been taken by boat across the Long Island Sound, hidden in a secret cabin. The police tried to follow every lead, but the kidnappers always seemed to stay one step ahead. They sent decoys, false directions, deliberate misdirection. Every time investigators thought they were close, the trail went cold. Finally, in early April, Lindbergh made a desperate decision. Against the advice of many, he agreed to pay. The ransom, now raised to $70,000, was gathered in a mixture of gold certificates and marked bills. The money was prepared with meticulous detail, each serial number recorded for future tracing. Condon arranged the drop. Under the cover of darkness, he delivered the money to another shadowy figure. In return, he was given a note, a promise that the child was safe, held in a boat named the Nellie off the Massachusetts coast. But when investigators scoured the area, they found nothing. No boat, no child, no trace. The Lindberghs were left in torment. They had obeyed every instruction, surrendered the ransom, and still their child had not returned. And as April turned to May, hope began to fade. The nation, once united in sympathy, now simmered with suspicion. Had Lindbergh himself somehow staged the crime? Had the family's servants betrayed them? Or was something darker at play, something that money and detectives could never solve? The line between fact and legend blurred more with each passing day, and soon a discovery would be made that would shatter the Lindbergh case forever. A discovery that would confirm the family's worst nightmare and cement the crime as one of the darkest chapters in American history. On May 12, 1932, 73 days after the kidnapping, the mystery of the Lindbergh baby took its darkest turn. A truck driver traveling along a back road near Hopewell, not far from the Lindbergh estate, noticed something strange at the edge of the woods. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags tossed carelessly into the underbrush. But as he drew closer, the truth revealed itself in a sight that would scar him forever. It was the body of a child. Investigators rushed to the scene, and what they found left even hardened policemen shaken. The remains were partially decomposed, lying face down in the soil. The baby's small clothing, still recognizable, matched what Charles Jr. had been wearing the night he was taken. His skull bore a fracture, the apparent cause of death. Some investigators believed the child had been killed almost immediately after the kidnapping, perhaps on the very night he was taken. But other details were far stranger. The body was found less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh home, in an area that had supposedly been searched multiple times by hundreds of volunteers. How could so many have missed it? Was it truly overlooked, or had the child's remains been placed there later, deliberately, as a cruel message? Even more chilling, the ground around the body showed no clear footprints, no drag marks, no sign of animals disturbing the soil. It was as though the child had appeared there suddenly, deposited in silence. Word spread quickly, and soon the nation knew the awful truth. The Lindbergh baby was dead. The public reaction was one of collective grief. Newspapers printed black borders around their headlines. Radio announcers delivered the news in hushed, mournful tones. People wept openly in the streets, as if the entire country had lost a child of its own. For Charles and Anne, the discovery shattered what little strength they had left. Anne reportedly collapsed when shown a piece of her son's clothing. Charles retreated into silence, later described by friends as a man turned to stone. Yet even in grief, the strangeness of the case only deepened. The ransom had been paid, and yet the baby had not been returned. Was this proof that the kidnappers had never intended to give him back? Or did it suggest something even darker? That the ransom was never about money at all, but about humiliation, or revenge, or ritual. Neighbors recalled that the night before the discovery, strange lights had again been seen flickering in the woods. Some swore they heard the sound of chanting, carried faintly on the wind. Others whispered of figures moving among the trees, though no one dared approach. When the body was found the next morning, many took it as proof that the crime had been cloaked in something beyond the ordinary. Folklore soon wrapped itself around the tragedy. Old farmers claimed the land around the Lindbergh estate had always been cursed, pointing to tales of Lenape burial grounds, whispered hauntings, and unexplained accidents that had plagued the region for generations. Some even connected the double circle symbol from the ransom notes to occult traditions brought over from Europe. Signs meant not just to mark authorship, but to bind a pact. Whether superstition or fact, the idea took hold. The Lindberghs had been touched by forces that went beyond crime. The official investigation pressed on. Police now had two priorities: to trace the ransom money and to identify the kidnappers. The bills, mostly gold certificates, were marked, their serial numbers carefully recorded. As weeks turned to months, these bills began to surface in banks and businesses across New York. Each time one appeared, detectives descended on the location, interrogating clerks and customers. A pattern slowly emerged, pointing toward the Bronx. But for every lead followed, new rumors sprouted. Some said the mafia had orchestrated the crime. Others pointed to Lindbergh's political enemies. Still, others whispered that the entire affair was a smokescreen, that the baby had not died at all, but had been spirited away, perhaps to be raised in secret, perhaps for reasons too dark to voice. Through it all, Anne Morrow Lindbergh continued to have dreams. She wrote later of waking in the middle of the night to hear a baby's cry echoing through the halls of the empty nursery, a sound that would fade when she entered the room, leaving only silence. Servants reported the same, the faint sound of a child weeping when no one was there. Whether hallucinations born of grief or something more, the Lindbergh estate was said to have grown cold, heavy, oppressive. Visitors spoke of a chill that clung to the walls, of shadows that seemed to move when no one else was near. Some refused to enter the nursery at all. The murder of the Lindbergh baby had become more than a crime. It was now a legend, thick with fear, rumor, and sorrow. The investigation would continue, leading eventually to one of the most famous trials in American history. But already, The sense had taken root that something unnatural hovered over the case, something that blurred the line between justice and haunting. And the strange truth was this: even as detectives closed in on their suspect, the questions surrounding the Lindbergh tragedy only grew darker. The discovery of the baby's body brought grief, but it also reignited the determination of investigators. Now, with ransom money in circulation, they had a tangible lead. Every bank teller in New York City, every cashier, every clerk had been warned. Look for gold certificates and check the numbers carefully. It worked. Over the following months, marked bills began to appear, surfacing in gas stations, corner stores, and even theaters. Each time, police traced the bill back as far as possible. The trail was frustratingly cold. The bills often passed through several hands before detection, but gradually, a picture emerged. Most of the ransom money was circulating in a particular neighborhood in the Bronx. Detectives staked out bars and shops, sometimes hiding for days, watching, and slowly, suspicion began to fall on one man, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant, carpenter by trade, who lived quietly with his wife and young son. On September 19th, 1934, more than 2 years after the kidnapping, Hauptmann was arrested after a gas station attendant accepted a $10 gold certificate and grew suspicious enough to check the number. Police descended on Hauptmann's home, and what they found there shocked even the most jaded officers. Hidden in his garage, inside a crude wooden box, was a stash of ransom money, nearly $14,000 of it. And that wasn't all. In his workshop, investigators found wood that matched the homemade ladder left at the Lindbergh estate. Grain for grain, cut for cut, the match was undeniable. The case seemed solved. Newspapers screamed, "We've found the baby's killer." The nation rejoiced that justice was near. But almost immediately, doubts crept in. Hauptmann protested his innocence from the moment of his arrest. He claimed the money had been left with him by a friend, now dead. He insisted he had never set foot near the Lindbergh estate, and some of the evidence against him seemed strangely convenient. The ladder wood matched. But was it truly unique? Or had the police forced the match? The handwriting on the ransom notes resembled Hauptmann's. But handwriting experts often contradicted each other. And strangest of all, despite thousands of fingerprints taken at the Lindbergh home, the ladder, and the ransom notes, not a single usable print was ever identified as Hauptmann's. It was as though the crime had been scrubbed clean. Meanwhile, rumors of darker forces persisted. Some whispered that Hauptmann was just a scapegoat, chosen to calm a furious public. Others swore the true culprits were never caught, and that the child's death had been the result of a ritualistic act carried out by a secretive group. And then there were the coincidences. The very night Hauptmann was arrested, a lightning storm broke over New Jersey, cracking the sky open above Hopewell. Locals later said it felt like the heavens themselves were delivering a verdict. At the same hour, Anne Lindbergh claimed she woke from another dream, one in which she saw her child walking hand in hand with a faceless figure into the woods, never once looking back. The arrest also failed to quiet the strange phenomena surrounding the Lindbergh estate. Servants continued to hear a child crying in the empty nursery. Visitors described cold drafts that swept the house even when every window was shut. And some claimed to see a small shadow moving along the upstairs hall, too small to be an adult, too fleeting to be explained. The case against Hauptmann grew stronger on paper, but weaker in the hearts of those who looked deeper. Yes, he had the money. Yes, the wood matched. But could one man alone have carried out such a bold crime? Climbed a ladder, stolen a child, vanished into the night, all without being seen or heard? Many believed there had to be others involved. Some even whispered that the truth reached higher, that powerful figures shielded the real criminals, and Hauptmann was merely the sacrifice. As the trial approached, the public treated it not just as a case, but as a spectacle. Crowds lined up for tickets as if it were a Broadway play. Reporters from across the world descended on the courthouse in Flemington, New Jersey. Photographers jostled for position. Vendors sold souvenirs, Lindbergh buttons, justice for the baby ribbons, even miniature ladders carved from wood. It was more than a trial. It was theatre. It was ritual. It was America demanding closure to a story that had torn open its heart. And yet, behind the flashing cameras and packed courtrooms, shadows lingered. Questions without answers, omens without explanation, dreams that refused to fade. For as much as investigators wanted this to be a simple case of crime and punishment, the Lindbergh tragedy continued to resist explanation, as though something unseen still pulled at its edges. And when the trial began, those shadows would only grow darker. In January 1935, 3 years after the disappearance of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the nation's eyes turned to the small town of Flemington, New Jersey. Here, in a red brick courthouse on Main Street, Bruno Richard Hauptmann would stand trial for what the press had already named the crime of the century. From the very first day, the atmosphere felt less like justice and more like spectacle. Thousands descended on Flemington, journalists from every major paper, European correspondents, curiosity seekers, vendors hawking trinkets. Hotels overflowed, locals rented out spare rooms, even barns to those desperate to witness history. And outside the courthouse, a carnival-like energy buzzed, as though grief had transformed into theatre. Inside, however, the mood was deadly serious. The prosecution laid out its case with devastating simplicity. Hauptmann had built the ladder. Hauptmann had written the ransom notes. Hauptmann had hidden the money. And Hauptmann, they insisted, had stolen and murdered the Lindbergh baby. Witness after witness took the stand. Handwriting experts compared the ransom notes to Hauptmann's letters. Wood specialists testified that the ladder had been fashioned from boards in Hauptmann's attic. The gas station attendant recounted the day Hauptmann handed him the marked bill. Piece by piece, the state assembled its story. But the defense countered with its own narrative, that Hauptmann was a victim of circumstance, an immigrant carpenter framed by a desperate police force under immense public pressure. They pointed out the lack of fingerprints, the inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts, the possibility that the ransom money had been planted. They reminded the jury that grief, outrage, and the hunger for closure were powerful forces that could warp justice. And then there was the atmosphere inside the courtroom itself. Reporters later wrote that it felt charged. The Lindberghs sat in the front row, their grief palpable, their presence almost holy to the jury. Anne Lindbergh was often described as ghostly pale, her eyes distant, as though she could still hear the cries of her son. Charles, stoic and unyielding, seemed less a father than a monument, embodying the rage and sorrow of the entire nation. Yet even in the heart of the proceedings, whispers of the uncanny persisted. On several occasions, spectators claimed to hear the faint sound of a baby crying inside the courthouse, though no child was present. A photographer swore that when he developed his plates, a blurred shape appeared near the witness stand. The outline of a child, half formed in silver and shadow. And on the final day of testimony, as Anne left the courthouse, she reportedly collapsed, overcome by a sudden vision of her son standing by the doorway, reaching for her before fading into air. Whether hallucinations born of trauma or something beyond, these moments only deepened the legend. After 5 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 12 hours. On February 13, 1935, they returned with a verdict: guilty. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The crowd outside erupted into cheers. Bells rang. Strangers embraced in the streets. For many, it was closure. For others, It was merely the end of one chapter in a story that refused to be contained. Hauptmann maintained his innocence to the very end. Even as the date of his execution drew near, he never confessed. "I am absolutely innocent of the crime," he said in his final statement. "I am at peace with God." On April 3rd, 1936, he was executed in the electric chair at Trenton State Prison. Witnesses said he faced his death with eerie calm, his expression unreadable. But the night did not pass quietly. As the switch was thrown, a storm broke over Trenton. Thunder rolled across the sky. Lightning split the prison yard. And in Hopewell, miles away, the Lindbergh estate was said to tremble. Servants later swore that every clock in the house stopped for exactly 2 minutes. The precise moment of Hauptmann's death. Coincidence? Or the final punctuation in a story already thick with dark symbols? In the years that followed, the legend only grew. Some insisted Hauptmann was innocent, a scapegoat sacrificed to appease a grieving nation. Others believed he had accomplices who were never brought to justice. And still others whispered that the truth had less to do with crime than with curses, rituals, or forces beyond understanding. Even today, historians and conspiracy theorists debate the Lindbergh case. Was the ladder really conclusive evidence? Why were no fingerprints ever found? Why had the baby's body been discovered in a place already searched? And what about the symbols on the ransom notes? Were they crude marks of a criminal or echoes of something older, darker? And then there are the stories of the estate itself. Long after the Lindberghs moved away, locals avoided the property. Hunters reported strange lights in the woods. Children dared each other to approach the old house and swore they heard crying from the upstairs windows. The nursery remained sealed for decades, as if to trap whatever haunted it inside. Anne Lindbergh lived into the 1990s, but friends claimed she never escaped the shadows of 1932. She spoke rarely of her first child, but in her journals she returned again and again to dreams. Dreams of an empty crib, of faceless strangers, of her son's hand slipping from hers into darkness. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping was never just a crime. It was, and remains, a wound in America's collective memory. A story where justice and legend intertwine, where grief and superstition overlap, where even today the truth feels just out of reach. And perhaps that is why the case still haunts us, because it forces us to confront the possibility that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, that some tragedies linger not as facts, but as phantoms, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing of all is not what we know, but what we can never know. The Lindbergh case was called the crime of the century. Nearly 100 years later, it still feels like a wound that never healed. A child stolen from his crib. A nation held hostage by ransom notes. A suspect executed, but questions left unanswered. Was Bruno Richard Hauptmann truly guilty, or was he the scapegoat of a desperate investigation? Did others help him? Or was there something darker, something unexplainable, at work that night in Hopewell, New Jersey? The truth may have died with those who lived it, but the echoes remain. In the old newspaper clippings, in the court transcripts, in the whispers that still cling to the Lindbergh estate. And maybe that is the real power of this story, not in what it reveals, but in what it hides. Because every time we look back, we are forced to confront the same unsettling possibility. That evil can strike anywhere, even in the safest of homes. That grief can bend reality until it feels haunted. And that some mysteries are destined never to be solved. So the next time you hear a strange sound in the night, or catch sight of a shadow moving where no one should be, remember the Lindbergh baby, remember the ladder against the nursery window, and remember that some legends never fade. What do you think? Was justice served in 1936, or was the real truth buried forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as chilling as we did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you'll never miss our next dive into the darkest mysteries of American history. Because sometimes the past refuses to stay buried.